The moment Senator Bradley Hayes spotted me at the head table, his face drained of all color, like someone had pulled a plug. His confident political smile crumbled into something between terror and rage. The fundraiser's organizers had just escorted him to what they thought was the place of honor. Instead, he found himself staring directly at the one person in America who could destroy everything he'd built. He started screaming at the top of his lungs, pointing at me with a trembling finger, because he knew I had the evidence that would end his career forever. My phone buzzed at 7:30 that Tuesday morning, while I was brewing coffee in my downtown apartment. Dad's text appeared on the screen. "Skip the reunion today. Lisa's boyfriend is State Senator Hayes. We need to make a good impression. Don't want any complications." I stared at those words for a solid minute, my coffee maker gurgling in the background. 34 years old, and this was the first time in my entire life my family had uninvited me from a reunion. I'd attended every single one since childhood, from the massive gatherings at Uncle Frank's farm to the smaller ones at my parents' house in suburban Sacramento. The reunion was supposed to celebrate Grandma Rose's 85th birthday. She'd specifically asked me to bring copies of my recent newspaper articles because she loved showing them to everyone. Now, I was being told to stay home. Lisa had introduced Bradley Hayes 3 months earlier at our usual Sunday dinner. I'd recognized him immediately, but kept quiet, not wanting to spoil the meal. My sister looked happier than I'd seen her in years, practically glowing whenever she talked about her new boyfriend. She'd been through 2 difficult breakups, and seeing her smile again meant everything to our family. Hayes had been charming that evening, asking thoughtful questions about everyone's lives. He'd complimented Mom's roast chicken, discussed baseball with Dad, and even remembered to ask about my nephew Tyler's soccer tournament. The perfect boyfriend performance. My phone rang 20 minutes after the text. Mom's voice sounded strained when I answered. "Blaine, honey, I hope you understand about today." "Not really, Mom. Help me understand why I'm suddenly not welcome at Grandma's party." She sighed heavily. "It's not that you're not welcome. We just think it might be better if you sit this one out. Lisa's relationship with Bradley is getting serious, and we don't want anything to jeopardize that." "What exactly am I going to do that would jeopardize anything?" "Well, you know how you get when you meet politicians. All those probing questions about their policies and voting records. Bradley's career is really taking off, and Lisa thinks he might propose soon. We just want everything to go smoothly." The implication stung worse than if she'd slapped me. My family saw my journalism career as an embarrassment rather than something to be proud of. To them, I was the son who asked uncomfortable questions and wrote stories that made important people angry. "I've never been anything but professional, Mom." "I know, sweetheart, but your recent articles about corruption in state government have gotten a lot of attention. Bradley mentioned he read some of them. We just think it would be awkward." Dad's voice came on the line then. He must have been listening on the extension. "Son, this could be really important for Lisa's future. Bradley Hayes is going places. He's already being talked about as a potential candidate for higher office. If they get married, it could open doors for our whole family." "So you're asking me to skip Grandma's birthday because my career might embarrass you?" "That's not what we're saying," Mom protested, but her tone suggested otherwise. "Look," Dad continued, "we're not asking you to change who you are. Just give them some space to build their relationship without any professional conflicts getting in the way." I understood what they weren't saying. They'd chosen the senator's comfort over their own son's presence. The message was clear. Hayes was more valuable to the family than I was. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'll stay away." "Really?" Mom sounded surprised by my cooperation. "Really. Tell Grandma I love her, and that I'll bring her gift by tomorrow." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen feeling hollow. I'd spent the last decade building a reputation as one of California's most respected investigative journalists. My stories had led to reforms in housing policy, exposed fraudulent charities, and helped send 3 corrupt city council members to prison. But to my family, I was just the troublemaker who might ask awkward questions. The irony wasn't lost on me. that I'd been planning to attend a charity fundraiser that same evening. The Children's Hospital Foundation was honoring major donors at their annual gala, and I'd contributed $25,000 to their new pediatric wing. My commitment to helping underprivileged kids stemmed from covering too many stories about children failed by the system. I'd bought my ticket months ago before I knew about Lisa's relationship. The event would be at the Riverside Country Club, one of Sacramento's most prestigious venues. Black tie champagne reception dinner with the city's elite. Normally, I'd skip such gatherings, but children's healthcare was one cause I supported without reservation. Getting dressed that evening, I thought about how different my night would be from my family's reunion. They'd be at my parents' house, everyone fussing over Senator Hayes, while I spent the evening with judges, business leaders, and medical professionals. There was something poetic about being honored the same night I'd been excluded. The country club's parking lot was filled with luxury cars when I arrived. Mercedes, BMW, Tesla, a few Bentleys. I drove my modest Honda Civic, past them all amused by the contrast. Inside the ballroom was elegantly decorated with white lilies and soft lighting. Round tables surrounded a dance floor, with a head table positioned prominently at the front. I checked in at the registration table where volunteer coordinator Nancy Walsh handed me my table assignment. Table 1, Mr. Coleman. That's the head table reserved for our most generous supporters. Are you sure I don't need any special recognition? Absolutely sure. Your donation was extraordinary, and the board specifically requested you be seated with our other distinguished guests. The head table was positioned on a raised platform, giving diners a clear view of the entire ballroom. Place cards showed I'd be sitting between Federal Judge Patricia Walsh and Police Chief Martha Rodriguez. Across from me were seats for Dr. Raymond Torres, the hospital's chief of surgery, and another empty chair marked special guest. I mingled during the cocktail hour, catching up with sources and colleagues from my journalism work. Superior Court Judge Michael Harrison complimented my recent series about prison reform. District Attorney Rebecca Martinez thanked me for my coverage of her office's initiatives against elder abuse. City Council member David Chen mentioned how my articles had helped build support for affordable housing programs. These were people who appreciated my work, who understood its value. Being around them reminded me why I'd chosen this career, despite the personal costs. As dinner service began, event coordinator Jennifer Adams approached our table with an apologetic expression. I'm sorry for the confusion, but we have a last-minute addition to your table. State Senator Bradley Hayes will be joining you this evening. He's being recognized for his support of child welfare legislation. My stomach dropped, but I kept my expression neutral. Of all the tables in the ballroom, he was being seated at mine. Of course, I replied calmly. The more the merrier. The twist of fate was almost amusing. I'd been excluded from my family gathering to avoid awkwardness with Senator Hayes, only to end up dining with him at a formal event. The universe had a strange sense of humor. Judge Walsh leaned over as we took our seats. I understand you know Senator Hayes personally. We've met, I said simply. He's done good work on children's issues, she continued. Though I have to say, I'm more impressed by your investigative reporting. That series you wrote about the foster care system led to real reforms. Police Chief Rodriguez nodded in agreement. Your work has made my job easier in several cases. It's good to have journalists who care about getting the facts right. Their respect meant more to me than they could know. These were people who dedicated their careers to justice and public service, and they valued what I did. The ballroom lights dimmed as the evening's program began. Senator Hayes would arrive any moment, and our awkward family drama would play out in front of Sacramento's most influential citizens. I adjusted my tie and prepared for whatever was about to unfold. The history between Senator Hayes and me stretched back 5 years to a cold February morning when I'd received an anonymous tip about irregularities in state construction contracts. The caller had refused to identify themselves but provided specific details about suspicious bidding patterns involving a company called Goldstone Development. What started as a routine investigation into contract procedures became the most significant story of my career. Week after week, I dug deeper into the connections between Goldstone and several state officials. The company consistently won bids, despite submitting higher prices than their competitors. Their projects regularly ran over budget and behind schedule, yet they continued receiving new contracts. The breakthrough came when I discovered Senator Hayes's wife had briefly worked as a consultant for Goldstone 3 years earlier, earning $60,000 for what appeared to be minimal work. Further investigation revealed Hayes's campaign had received substantial donations from Goldstone executives and their family members. I'd spent months building the case methodically. Phone records showed frequent communication between Hayes and Goldstone president Marcus Webb. Financial documents revealed a pattern of contract amendments that favored the company. Former state employees spoke confidentially about pressure to approve Goldstone proposals, despite obvious deficiencies. The most damning evidence came from state engineer Rebecca Torres, who'd been forced to sign off on substandard work. She'd documented numerous safety violations and cost overruns, but was told to approve the projects anyway. Her detailed records showed Hayes personally calling her supervisor to ensure Goldstone's work was accepted. 3 other engineers came forward with similar stories. Environmental Inspector David Kim provided evidence of falsified impact studies. Procurement Officer Jennifer Martinez revealed documents showing Hayes's office had changed bidding criteria to favor Goldstone after other companies had submitted lower bids. My article series, titled Concrete Evidence, ran for 5 consecutive days in March. Each installment revealed another layer of corruption building to an explosive finale that called for Hayes's immediate resignation and criminal investigation. The public response was overwhelming. Citizens demanded accountability. Editorial boards across the state called for investigations. Federal prosecutors opened a preliminary inquiry. Hayes's approval ratings plummeted 20 points in 2 weeks. Then everything fell apart. Rebecca Torres suddenly recanted her testimony, claiming I'd misquoted her and taken documents out of context. Within days, David Kim and Jennifer Martinez followed suit, withdrawing their statements and refusing further comment. My most crucial sources vanished overnight. Hayes' legal team, led by high-profile attorney Thomas Richardson, launched a counteroffensive that was surgical in its precision. They questioned every aspect of my reporting, demanding corrections for minor factual errors, while ignoring the larger pattern of evidence. They threatened lawsuits against my newspaper for damages to Hayes's reputation. More troubling were the rumors about what had happened to my sources. Rebecca Torres received a promotion to a comfortable desk job in the state capitol. David Kim was transferred to a different department with a substantial salary increase. Jennifer Martinez left state employment entirely, reportedly, to take a lucrative position with a private consulting firm. The federal investigation stalled when prosecutors couldn't secure witness cooperation. Without testimony from the engineers and inspectors, the documentary evidence wasn't sufficient for criminal charges. Hayes emerged from the scandal stronger than before, positioning himself as a victim of irresponsible journalism. He'd given a memorable press conference outside the state capitol, surrounded by supporters and fellow politicians. With cameras rolling, he denounced the epidemic of fake news that seeks to destroy public servants through innuendo and half-truths. Investigative journalism serves an important function in our democracy, he'd said, looking directly into the cameras. But when reporters abandon their commitment to facts and fairness, they become a threat to the very institutions they claim to protect. The speech was masterfully delivered, hitting all the right notes about media responsibility and public service. Hayes had transformed himself from corrupt politician to righteous victim, and the public had largely bought it. The experience had shaken my faith in the system's ability to deliver justice. I'd done everything right, followed every lead, documented every connection, yet a guilty man had walked free, while my reputation suffered. Several sources refused to work with me for months afterward, worried about retaliation. But I hadn't given up. Over the following years, I'd rebuilt my credibility through careful, methodical reporting on other corruption cases. My exposé of fraudulent city contracts in Fresno led to 4 convictions. My investigation into misuse of education funds resulted in the resignation of 3 school district officials. My series on elder abuse in state-licensed facilities prompted legislative reforms and criminal prosecutions. Each success had restored a piece of my professional standing. Fellow journalists respected my tenacity. Law enforcement agencies trusted my discretion. Government watchdog groups sought my expertise. I'd proven that one failed case, no matter how high profile, didn't define my career. Yet Senator Hayes remained a source of frustration. I'd continued monitoring his activities, knowing the corruption hadn't stopped. Goldstone Development had grown even larger, winning increasingly valuable contracts. Hayes had risen in political prominence, chairing important committees and building influence throughout state government. I'd gathered new evidence over the years, but lacked the definitive proof needed to break through his defensive wall. Hayes had learned from our previous encounter, covering his tracks more carefully while continuing to enrich himself and his associates. The worst part was watching him date my sister. Lisa had no idea about our professional history. She'd mentioned her new boyfriend was a state senator, but I hadn't connected it to Hayes until that Sunday dinner. Seeing him charm my family while knowing what he really was had been almost unbearable. Yet I'd said nothing. Lisa deserved happiness, and I couldn't destroy her relationship based on old grievances and incomplete evidence. My family already saw my journalism career as a source of conflict. Revealing my history with Hayes would have convinced them I was motivated by spite rather than justice. So, I'd remained silent watching a corrupt politician court my sister while building his political career on a foundation of lies and stolen taxpayer money. The situation had eaten at me for months, but I'd prioritized family harmony over professional satisfaction. Now, sitting at this charity gala head table, that delicate balance was about to be shattered. Hayes would walk into this ballroom expecting an evening of recognition and networking. Instead, he'd find himself face to face with the one journalist in California who knew exactly what he was. The irony was perfect and terrible. My family had excluded me to protect Hayes from awkwardness, yet fate had arranged our most public confrontation yet. In a room full of judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials, Hayes would have to maintain his composure while sitting across from his greatest professional threat. I straightened my napkin and checked my watch. Any moment now, he'd walk through those doors and realize his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The ballroom's double doors swung open precisely at 8:15, and Senator Bradley Hayes strode in with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. His perfectly tailored black tuxedo and gleaming American flag pin caught the chandelier light as he paused to survey the gathered crowd. The smile that had charmed voters across California spread across his face as he spotted familiar faces at various tables. Event coordinator Jennifer Adams hurried over to escort him to the head table, gesturing proudly toward the elevated platform where the evening's most distinguished guests were seated. Hayes followed her lead, nodding graciously to supporters who called out greetings from their tables. His expression never wavered until he reached the head table steps. There, climbing toward his assigned seat, his eyes met mine for the first time in 5 years. The transformation was instantaneous and stunning. Hayes's confident smile collapsed like a demolished building, his face draining to an ashen gray that made his perfectly applied makeup look like stage paint. His feet actually stopped moving mid-step, causing Jennifer Adams to bump into him from behind. "Senator Hayes," she asked with concern, "is everything all right?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze locked on mine with a mixture of shock and recognition that bordered on panic. I offered him the polite nod I'd give any dinner companion, keeping my expression neutral and professional. "Fine," he managed finally, though his voice had lost its usual commanding tone. "Just recognizing an old acquaintance." Jennifer beamed, pleased to discover a connection. "Oh, wonderful, Senator Hayes. You're seated right across from Blaine Coleman, our guest of honor this evening." Blaine is one of the Sacramento Herald's most distinguished investigative journalists, and tonight's largest individual donor to the Children's Hospital. If possible, Hayes went even paler. Learning that I was the guest of honor, rather than some random attendee, clearly hadn't been part of his calculations for the evening. I stood as he approached, extending my hand with the courtesy my grandmother had drilled into me decades ago. "Senator Hayes." What a pleasant surprise! His handshake was weak, his palm already damp with perspiration despite the ballroom's comfortable temperature. "Blaine, I had no idea you'd be here tonight." "The Children's Hospital is a cause close to my heart," I replied evenly. "I imagine you feel the same way, given your legislative work on child welfare issues." Federal Judge Patricia Walsh, seated to my right, looked up from her salad with interest. "Do you two know each other well?" "We have some professional history," I answered before Hayes could speak. "The senator has been the subject of several of my articles over the years." Hayes's jaw tightened at this accurate but clearly unwelcome description of our relationship. "Blaine writes about many state officials. It's part of his job." "Indeed it is," agreed Police Chief Martha Rodriguez from across the table. "Though I have to say, Blaine's reporting has been incredibly valuable to law enforcement. His investigative series often uncover information that helps us pursue cases we wouldn't have known about otherwise." Dr. Raymond Torres nodded enthusiastically. "That series you wrote about fraud in medical device procurement saved the state millions of dollars. The reforms that followed made our purchasing process much more transparent." Hayes forced his political smile back into place, though it looked more like a grimace. "Well, investigative journalism certainly serves an important function in our democracy. When it's done responsibly," he added pointedly. Judge Walsh raised an eyebrow at the implicit criticism. "I've found Blaine's work to be exceptionally well-researched and fair. His coverage of judicial reform initiatives has been both balanced and insightful." The conversation was clearly making Hayes uncomfortable, which hadn't been my intention, but was certainly illuminating. A truly innocent politician would have been pleased to sit with a respected journalist. Hayes's obvious distress suggested his conscience wasn't entirely clear. As the first course arrived, Hayes attempted to regain control of the situation. He launched into a practiced speech about his commitment to transparency in government and his appreciation for the media's watchdog role. It was polished politician speak, designed to sound substantive while saying nothing meaningful. Of course, we all know how important it is to verify sources and check facts thoroughly before publication, he said, looking directly at me. Careers and reputations can be destroyed by careless reporting. The comment was clearly intended as a warning, a reminder of our previous encounter and its aftermath. But it had the opposite effect Hayes intended, because it revealed his continuing anger about my investigation years after the supposed vindication. "Absolutely," I agreed calmly. "That's why I always triple-check my sources and maintain detailed documentation of everything I report. Professional integrity demands nothing less." Police Chief Rodriguez leaned forward with interest. "Speaking of current investigations, Blaine, are you working on anything particularly significant these days?" It was an innocent question, but Hayes's fork clattered against his plate as he waited for my answer. His reaction didn't go unnoticed by our table mates, all of whom had spent their careers reading people's behavior for signs of guilt or deception. "I'm always working on several stories simultaneously," I replied. "Government corruption seems to be an inexhaustible subject, unfortunately." "Any involving state-level officials?" asked Dr. Torres conversationally. Hayes' breathing had become noticeably shallow. Sweat was forming along his hairline despite the air conditioning. "I prefer not to discuss ongoing investigations," I said diplomatically. "But I will say that some recent developments have been quite surprising. Sometimes, the evidence for corruption is hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone to connect the dots." Hayes abruptly pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the raised platform floor. "Excuse me, I need to make a quick phone call." He strode away toward the ballroom exit, pulling out his cell phone with trembling fingers. Through the glass doors, I could see him pacing in the lobby, speaking rapidly to someone on the other end. Judge Walsh watched his departure, with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent 30 years observing suspicious behavior. "Interesting reaction," she murmured quietly. "For someone with nothing to hide, he seems remarkably agitated by the prospect of investigative journalism." Police Chief Rodriguez nodded slowly. "In my experience, innocent people don't run away from conversations about corruption investigations." Dr. Torres looked confused by the exchange. "Am I missing something here? There seemed to be some unusual tension between you two." I considered my words carefully. These were respected professionals who deserved honesty, but I also couldn't make specific accusations without proof. "Senator Hayes and I have disagreed about some of his policy positions and legislative priorities," I said finally. "He may feel that my coverage of his work has been overly critical." It was technically true, while avoiding the details that might constitute slander. But my dinner companions were intelligent people who could read between the lines. Hayes returned to the table 10 minutes later, his face flushed, and his earlier confidence completely absent. He'd clearly received some unwelcome news during his phone conversation, because his hands were visibly shaking as he picked up his napkin. "Everything all right, Senator?" asked Judge Walsh with apparent concern. "Fine, just some urgent legislative business," he replied unconvincingly. The remainder of the dinner passed in awkward tension. Hayes barely touched his food, responded to questions with obvious distraction, and kept checking his phone every few minutes. His political training was the only thing maintaining even a pretense of normalcy. Meanwhile, I enjoyed conversations with my table mates about various civic issues, criminal justice reforms, and healthcare initiatives. These were substantive discussions with people dedicated to public service, exactly the kind of engagement that reminded me why I'd chosen journalism as a career. As the evening's program began with speeches from hospital administrators and board members, Hayes' discomfort became impossible to hide. He was shifting constantly in his chair, dabbing sweat from his forehead, and glancing toward the exits like a trapped animal. Whatever phone call he'd received had clearly contained troubling news. Combined with my presence at his table, the senator was obviously reconsidering what should have been a routine public appearance. The question was whether he'd try to leave early or attempt to brazen out the situation. Either choice would be revealing in its own way. But I suspected the evening was about to become much more interesting than either of us had anticipated. As the Hospital Foundation's president concluded her remarks about the new pediatric wing, Senator Hayes seemed to reach some internal decision. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his tie, and turned to face me directly with what I recognized as his courtroom confrontation expression. "Blaine, I think we should address the elephant in the room." He began, his voice carrying just loudly enough for our entire table to hear. "I know you've been harboring some resentment about that series you wrote a few years back, the one where your sources didn't quite pan out. The comment was calculated to put me on the defensive, to paint me as a bitter journalist, nursing old grudges. It might have worked if I hadn't spent the intervening years preparing for exactly this moment." "Resentment isn't the right word, Senator," I replied calmly. "Professional curiosity would be more accurate." Judge Walsh set down her coffee cup, sensing the conversation had taken on new significance. Police Chief Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, adopting the relaxed posture of someone prepared to observe carefully. "Curiosity about what exactly?" Hayes pressed, clearly hoping to goad me into making accusations I couldn't substantiate. "About why someone would go to such extraordinary lengths to discredit witnesses who were telling the truth," I said evenly. "And about what they might be trying to hide that's worth such elaborate cover-ups." Hayes' confident expression faltered slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Senator. I'm stating facts." I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a folded document. Facts like the ones contained in this financial analysis of state highway contracts awarded over the past 18 months. The blood drained from Hayes' face as he stared at the papers in my hand. "What is that?" "Evidence of a corruption scheme that makes our previous disagreement look like a parking ticket. By comparison," I replied quietly. "Would you like me to summarize the highlights, or would you prefer to explain them yourself?" Dr. Torres looked fascinated by the exchange. This sounds like quite a story. It is indeed, I confirmed, unfolding the document. For instance, there's the curious case of 12 state highway projects, totaling $47 million in contracts, all awarded to the same company, despite higher bids than their competitors. Hayes' hands clenched into fists on the table. That's completely false. The company in question is Pinnacle Construction, which is owned by Marcus Hayes. I continued ignoring his denial. The senator's brother, for those keeping track of family connections. Police Chief Rodriguez straightened in her chair. Go on. The fascinating part is how these contracts were approved despite serious engineering concerns about safety standards and environmental compliance. State engineers were pressured to sign off on substandard work, while environmental inspectors were told to expedite approval processes that normally take months of careful review. Judge Walsh had pulled out her phone and was taking notes. Do you have documentation of this pressure? Recorded phone conversations between Senator Hayes and department supervisors, I replied, including one particularly illuminating discussion where the senator threatened to cut state funding for engineering positions if certain projects weren't approved immediately. Hayes was breathing rapidly now, his face cycling between pale and flushed. You're lying. Those recordings don't exist. Actually, they do. I smiled slightly. You see, Senator, one of the engineers you pressured, has been recording your conversations for the past 6 months. He was tired of being ordered to approve dangerous work that could get people killed. That's illegal wiretapping, Hayes sputtered. Not when one party to the conversation consents to the recording, Judge Walsh observed dryly, which is perfectly legal in California. I nodded. Engineer Thomas Richardson has provided extensive documentation of safety violations he was ordered to ignore, bridge inspections that were falsified, soil stability reports that were altered, environmental impact studies that were written by Pinnacle's own consultants rather than independent assessors. Dr. Torres whistled softly. That sounds incredibly dangerous. It is. 3 of the bridge projects involve spans over major rivers where structural failures could kill dozens of people. The environmental shortcuts have already resulted in significant water contamination near 2 construction sites. Hayes stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the platform. This is harassment, based on fabricated evidence. His raised voice was attracting attention from nearby tables. Other dinner guests were turning to see what was causing the commotion at the head table. Senator, perhaps you should sit down, suggested Police Chief Rodriguez firmly. I will not sit here and listen to this character assassination. Hayes declared his political composure completely abandoned. This man has a vendetta against me. He's been trying to destroy my career for years. By reporting facts, I asked quietly. By twisting facts to support predetermined narratives, Hayes shot back. By taking legitimate business relationships and making them sound sinister. By harassing honest contractors and intimidating state employees. Judge Walsh looked at Hayes with the expression she normally reserved for defendants, who were digging themselves into deeper holes. Senator, you might want to consider your words carefully. But Hayes was beyond listening to reason. Years of successful manipulation and political maneuvering had convinced him he could talk his way out of any situation. He'd forgotten he was surrounded by people trained to recognize guilty behavior. The truth is that Blaine Coleman is a failed journalist who can't accept that his big story fell apart. Hayes continued, his voice getting louder. He spent years nursing his wounded ego and looking for revenge against anyone who exposed his sloppy reporting. Several people at nearby tables had stopped eating to listen to the unfolding drama. Event coordinator Jennifer Adams was hurrying toward our table with obvious concern about the disruption. Is there a problem here? She asked diplomatically. Senator Hayes is just explaining his position on government transparency, I said calmly, still seated, while Hayes loomed over the table in obvious agitation. My position is that grandstanding journalists should focus on facts instead of pursuing personal vendettas, Hayes declared. Police Chief Rodriguez stood up her hand. moving instinctively toward her jacket, where her off-duty weapon was concealed. "Senator, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and return to your seat. I don't take orders from corrupt police chiefs who probably take bribes from this so-called investigative journalist." The accusation against Police Chief Rodriguez was a serious mistake. She was universally respected for her integrity and had spent 25 years building an impeccable reputation. Several people gasped audibly at Hayes's reckless words. "Senator Hayes," Judge Walsh said icily, "you need to stop talking immediately. You're making serious accusations that could constitute slander." But Hayes was beyond rational thought. The whole system is corrupt. Journalists, judges, police chiefs, all of you working together to destroy honest public servants. At this point, the ballroom had gone almost completely quiet. Hundreds of people were watching a state senator have what appeared to be a complete breakdown at the charity gala's head table. "Senator," I said quietly, "you should probably call your attorney." The suggestion seemed to penetrate Hayes's rage-induced fog. He looked around the ballroom, seeming to realize for the first time that his outburst was being witnessed by some of the most influential people in California. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "I have powerful friends, and they won't let you destroy me with fabricated evidence." With that ominous threat, he stormed away from the table, pushing through the confused crowd toward the ballroom exit. His departure left our table in stunned silence. "Well," said Dr. Torres finally, "that was illuminating." Judge Walsh was still taking notes on her phone. "I think I need to make some calls tonight. If those recordings actually exist, this could be a federal case." Police Chief Rodriguez nodded grimly. "I'll be in touch tomorrow, Blaine. We need to discuss protection protocols if Senator Hayes decides to escalate his threats." As the ballroom slowly returned to normal conversation, I reflected on how dramatically the evening had shifted. I'd expected awkwardness when Hayes discovered my presence. I hadn't expected him to essentially confess his guilt in front of a room full of witnesses. But something told me the real surprises were still to come. The ballroom had barely returned to normal conversation when the double doors burst open again, admitting a cluster of familiar figures I hadn't expected to see. My father strode in first, his face flushed with exertion and obvious anger. Behind him came my mother, looking confused and worried, followed by my sister Lisa, who appeared to be on the verge of tears. They spotted me immediately at the elevated head table, and Dad made a beeline through the crowd of startled dinner guests. His expression suggested I was about to receive the lecture of a lifetime. "Blaine Thomas Coleman," he called out as he climbed the steps to our platform. "What in the hell do you think you're doing here?" The use of my full name, delivered in his sternest parental voice, brought back memories of childhood punishments. But I was 34 years old, not 14, and his timing couldn't have been worse. "Good evening, Dad," I replied calmly. "Mom, Lisa, what brings you to the charity gala?" "Don't play dumb with us," Dad snapped. "We heard about your little scene with Bradley. The man called us in a panic, saying you were harassing him with made-up accusations." Mom reached our table, slightly out of breath. "Blaine, honey, what's gotten into you? Bradley said you were spreading terrible lies about his family." Lisa's eyes were red from crying. "How could you do this to me, Blaine?" On the one night when Bradley was being honored for his charitable work, Judge Walsh and Police Chief Rodriguez exchanged meaningful glances. This family drama was providing an unexpected window into the senator's character and tactics. "Lisa," I said gently, "what exactly did Bradley tell you?" "He said you'd been stalking him, that you fabricated evidence, and brought it here to humiliate him publicly." Lisa's voice was rising with emotion. "He said you've been jealous of our relationship and wanted to destroy it." "That's quite an interpretation," observed Police Chief Rodriguez dryly. Dad whirled to face her. "And who are you to judge this is a family matter?" "Actually, sir, I'm Chief Rodriguez of the Sacramento Police Department, and what I witnessed here tonight was a public official making serious threats against a journalist who was presenting evidence of government corruption." The identification seemed to deflate some of Dad's bluster. Evidence. What evidence? The kind that typically leads to federal investigations and criminal prosecutions. Judge Walsh added coolly. Mom looked bewildered. I don't understand. Bradley said Blaine was making things up. Mom, I said carefully, did Bradley mention anything specific about what I supposedly made up? He said you accused him of taking bribes and threatening state employees. Lisa answered tearfully. He said you had fake recordings that were actually just voice actors pretending to be him. The explanation was so ridiculous that Dr. Torres actually laughed out loud. Voice actors. That's the best defense he could come up with. It's not funny, Lisa snapped. You're destroying the man I love based on lies. Lisa, I said quietly, how long have you been dating Bradley? 8 months. What does that have to do with anything? 8 months, I repeated thoughtfully. When did he first ask you about my work? Lisa's expression flickered with confusion. What do you mean? I mean, when did he start asking questions about my journalism career? About what stories I was working on? About whether I'd mentioned him specifically? The confusion in Lisa's eyes was being replaced by something else. Uncertainty. He's naturally curious about your work, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. He's interested in journalism. Is he? I asked gently. Or is he interested in one specific journalist, who happens to be your brother? Police Chief Rodriguez leaned forward. Miss Coleman, has Senator Hayes ever asked you to share information about your brother's activities? His sources, his travel schedule? That's ridiculous, Dad interjected. Bradley Hayes is a respected public servant. Actually, said a new voice from behind us, he's not. We all turned to see Federal Agent Sarah Thompson approaching our table, her FBI credentials visible in her hand. She was followed by 2 other agents in dark suits, their serious expressions suggesting this wasn't a social visit. Agent Thompson, FBI, she announced, addressing our group. Senator Hayes has just been taken into custody on charges of conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Lisa's face went completely white. What? We've been investigating Senator Hayes for several months, Miss Coleman, Agent Thompson continued. Mr. Coleman's evidence provided the final pieces we needed to complete our case. Mom sank into an empty chair, looking stunned. Bradley's been arrested. He's currently being processed at the federal building downtown, Agent Thompson confirmed. The charges include accepting bribes from construction companies, threatening state employees, and manipulating the contract bidding process to benefit his family members. Dad looked like someone had hit him with a baseball bat. But he's a senator. He's respected. He was going to marry our daughter. He was using your daughter, Agent Thompson said bluntly. Our investigation revealed that Senator Hayes specifically targeted Miss Coleman because of her relationship to Mr. Coleman. He's been using her to gather information about ongoing investigations. Lisa made a choking sound that might have been a sob. No, that's not true. I'm afraid it is, Agent Thompson replied with professional sympathy. We have recordings of conversations where Senator Hayes discussed ways to neutralize Mr. Coleman's reporting through his family connections. Recordings? Mom asked weakly. Senator Hayes was remarkably careless about discussing criminal activities over the phone, Agent Thompson explained. We've documented extensive evidence of his corruption schemes, including plans to discredit or intimidate journalists who might expose him. I reached across the table to take Lisa's hand. I'm sorry, Lisa. I know this hurts. She jerked her hand away, tears streaming down her face. You knew, and you didn't tell me. I suspected, but I didn't have proof, and I hoped I was wrong. You could have warned me. Would you have believed me? I asked gently. The question hung in the air, because we all knew the answer. Lisa had been so happy, so convinced she'd found the perfect man, that any warnings would have fallen on deaf ears. Judge Walsh addressed Agent Thompson. What's the scope of this investigation? Extensive. We've identified a network of corrupt officials across 3 states. Senator Hayes was a central figure in a scheme that's cost taxpayers approximately $80 million over 4 years. Dr. Torres whistled softly. $80 million. The environmental damage from their shortcuts will cost even more to remediate, Agent Thompson added. Not to mention the public safety risks they created. Dad finally found his voice. And Blaine knew about all this? Mr. Coleman's investigation provided crucial evidence. Agent Thompson confirmed. His persistence in pursuing this case despite significant personal and professional costs has been instrumental in bringing these criminals to justice. The silence that followed was profound. My family was processing the realization that they'd chosen a criminal over their own son, that they'd excluded me from a family gathering to protect someone who'd been manipulating them all along. Mom spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. Blaine, we owe you an apology. More than an apology, Dad added, looking ashamed. We chose a stranger over our own family. Lisa was still crying, but her tears now seemed to be more about grief than anger. How could I have been so stupid? You weren't stupid, I assured her. You fell in love with someone who turned out to be different than you thought. It happens to good people all the time. Agent Thompson concluded her business and departed with her colleagues, leaving our family to process the evening's revelations. The charity gala was winding down around us, but our conversation was just beginning. What happens now? Lisa asked quietly. Now you heal, I replied. And our family figures out how to move forward from this. Can you forgive us? Mom asked. I looked around the table at my family's faces, seeing genuine remorse and love beneath their confusion and pain. There's nothing to forgive, I said. Family makes mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them. But even as I offered forgiveness, I knew it would take time for all of us to process the full implications of what had happened. The evening that began with my exclusion from a family gathering had ended with the exposure of corruption, the arrest of a criminal, and the beginning of a long journey toward healing. 2 weeks after the charity gala, I sat in a sterile conference room at the federal building, watching Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen spread dozens of photographs across the table. Each image showed documents seized from Senator Hayes' office and residence evidence of a corruption network more extensive than anyone had imagined. The scope keeps expanding, Chen explained, pointing to a chart showing connections between Hayes and officials in 3 states. Your investigation opened a door we didn't even know existed. FBI agent Sarah Thompson nodded from across the table. Hayes was just the California hub of a much larger operation. We've identified similar schemes in Nevada and Arizona, all connected through a network of construction companies and shell corporations. The evidence was overwhelming. Hayes had received over $400,000 in bribes, disguised as consulting fees, campaign donations, and business investments. His brother's construction company had been awarded contracts worth $12 million based on fraudulent bids and falsified safety reports. The environmental damage alone will take years to remediate, Chen continued. 3 bridge projects will need complete reconstruction. 2 highway sections are being shut down immediately due to structural deficiencies. But the most disturbing revelation was how far Hayes had been willing to go to protect his operation. Phone records showed he'd contacted private investigators to gather compromising information on potential whistleblowers. He'd discussed ways to frame honest state employees for misconduct. Most chilling were conversations where he'd considered physical intimidation of journalists and activists. He specifically targeted your family to neutralize you, Agent Thompson explained. Dating your sister wasn't coincidental. It was a calculated strategy to gain access to your personal life and professional activities. The manipulation had been systematic and cruel. Hayes had spent months learning about Lisa's interests, her previous relationships, her hopes for the future. He'd crafted a perfect boyfriend persona, designed to make her fall in love while using that love to gather intelligence about me. Phone recordings revealed Hayes discussing the relationship with his attorney, Thomas Richardson. The sister is completely infatuated, Hayes had said during one call. She tells me everything about her brother's work schedule, his sources, even his travel plans. It's better than having an inside source at his newspaper. Lisa had been devastated when Agent Thompson played that recording during our family meeting the previous week. Hearing the man she'd loved describe her as a useful tool, rather than a person, had shattered something inside her. "How did I miss the signs?" she'd asked repeatedly. "How was I so blind?" The answer was that Hayes had been very good at manipulation. He'd studied psychology in college before switching to political science, and he'd clearly retained enough knowledge to craft an irresistible romantic facade. Mom and Dad were struggling with their own guilt about excluding me from the reunion. They'd spent days apologizing, trying to make amends for choosing a criminal's comfort over their son's presence. The depth of their remorse was almost harder to bear than their original rejection. We let appearances matter more than family. Dad had admitted during a tearful conversation in their living room. We were so impressed by his title and his political connections that we forgot what really matters. Now, sitting in the federal building, I was learning the full extent of how wrong they'd been. Hayes hadn't been an impressive politician worthy of respect. He'd been a common criminal who'd used his office to steal from taxpayers and endanger public safety. The grand jury returned indictments yesterday, Chen informed me. Hayes and 14 co-conspirators on charges ranging from conspiracy to racketeering. Your testimony will be crucial to the prosecution. Whatever you need, I replied. Agent Thompson opened another file. There's something else you should know. Hayes attempted to hire someone to plant illegal materials in your apartment. The revelation was stunning even after everything I'd learned. What kind of materials? Child pornography on your computer. Illegal drugs in your bedroom. The plan was to have you arrested on serious charges that would destroy your credibility and end your career. I felt sick. Did he actually go through with it? The person he contacted was actually an undercover federal agent, Thompson explained. We'd been monitoring his communications for months. The solicitation itself is a separate federal crime. The ruthlessness was breathtaking. Hayes had been willing to frame me for the most serious crimes imaginable, rather than face accountability for his corruption. If his plan had succeeded, I would have lost everything while he continued stealing public money. How many other journalists did he target? I asked. At least 6 that we know of, Chen replied. 2 were successfully intimidated into dropping investigations. 3 others had their sources mysteriously dry up. You were the only one who kept pursuing the story, despite the pressure. The persistence had come at a personal cost I was only beginning to understand. Years of professional isolation, strained relationships with sources, family conflicts, and constant stress had taken their toll. There were times I'd questioned whether fighting corruption was worth the personal sacrifice. Your work saved lives, Thompson emphasized. Those bridge projects with falsified safety reports could have collapsed during rush hour traffic. The environmental contamination was poisoning groundwater used by thousands of families. The reminder helped put things in perspective. Individual sacrifice seemed small compared to preventing such tragedies. Chen handed me another document. The state legislature has already announced hearings on procurement reform. They're calling it the Coleman Protocols after your investigative work. The naming honor was gratifying, but more important were the substantive changes being implemented. Independent oversight boards, mandatory engineering review periods, public disclosure of all contract relationships. Reforms that would make future corruption much more difficult. What about the other officials in Nevada and Arizona? I asked. Arrests are happening as we speak, Thompson replied. This network has been operating for at least 6 years. The total amount stolen from taxpayers is approaching $200 million. $200 million that could have funded schools, hospitals, infrastructure improvements, and social services. Instead, it had been diverted to enrich corrupt politicians and their criminal associates. The trials will probably take 2 years to complete, Chen warned. Hayes' attorneys are already suggesting he might cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Will that help the prosecution? Enormously. Hayes has detailed knowledge of corrupt officials we haven't identified yet. His cooperation could expose dozens of additional criminals. As the meeting concluded, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that text message from Dad 2 weeks ago. What had seemed like family rejection had ultimately led to the biggest corruption case in California history and the exposure of a multi-state criminal network. Lisa was attending therapy to process her emotional trauma. Mom and Dad were reevaluating their priorities and values. I was receiving recognition from journalism organizations and government watchdog groups. But the most satisfying outcome was simpler than professional accolades or family reconciliation. Corrupt politicians were going to prison. Public money would be protected. Dangerous construction projects were being fixed before they could hurt anyone. Justice delayed but not denied was finally being served. 6 months later, I stood in the familiar warmth of my parents' backyard on a perfect California Saturday afternoon, watching my nephew Tyler kick a soccer ball while our extended family gathered for Grandma Rose's 86th birthday celebration. The same reunion I'd been excluded from the previous year was now a joyous occasion, marking both her birthday and a family that had learned to value truth over appearances. Senator Bradley Hayes had been sentenced 3 weeks earlier to 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy racketeering and attempted evidence tampering. 12 other officials received sentences ranging from 4 to 15 years. The total amount of recovered taxpayer money reached $237 million funds that were being redirected to infrastructure repairs and social programs. Lisa walked over carrying a plate of Grandma's famous apple pie, her smile genuine for the first time in months. She'd completed intensive therapy and was now dating Dr. Michael Torres, the pediatric surgeon who'd sat at our table during the charity gala. Their relationship was built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than manipulation and deception. "Grandma wants you to bring the Pulitzer over," Lisa said, settling into the lawn chair beside me. "She's still telling everyone about her grandson, who won the most important award in journalism." The Pulitzer Prize for Public Service sat in its place of honor on the dining room table, surrounded by family photos and birthday cards. The citation read, "For courageous investigative reporting that exposed a multi-state corruption network leading to criminal prosecutions and significant government reforms." But the professional recognition, while meaningful, wasn't what made this gathering special. What mattered was the family conversation that had taken place around this same picnic table 2 months earlier, when everyone had gathered to discuss what we'd learned from the Hayes experience. Dad had spoken first, his voice heavy with remorse. "I spent 40 years building a successful business by reading people's character. Yet, I was completely fooled by a criminal because I was impressed by his title and political connections." Mom had nodded through tears. "We chose what looked respectable over what was actually right. We excluded our son to impress a man who turned out to be a fraud." The conversation had been painful, but necessary. We talked about how appearances can deceive, how titles and positions don't guarantee character, and how family loyalty should be based on love and truth, rather than social convenience. Lisa had been the most changed by the experience. "I fell in love with a carefully constructed lie," she'd admitted. "Bradley studied my interests, my hopes, my fears, and he became exactly what I thought I wanted. But none of it was real." Her healing process had included recognizing the red flags she'd ignored. How Hayes had always steered conversations toward my work. How he'd discouraged her from mentioning our relationship to his political colleagues. How he'd gradually isolated her from friends who might have asked uncomfortable questions. "The scary part is how good he was at it," she'd continued. "If you hadn't exposed his crimes, I probably would have married him. I would have spent my life with someone who saw me as a useful object rather than a person." The therapy had helped her understand that being victimized by a skilled manipulator didn't make her stupid or weak. Hayes had fooled experienced politicians, veteran journalists, and sophisticated business leaders. His deception was comprehensive and professionally executed. Now watching Lisa laugh with Dr. Torres, While they organized games for the younger kids, I could see she'd reclaimed her joy and her ability to trust. Their relationship was everything her connection with Hayes had pretended to be: honest, supportive, and built on genuine compatibility rather than calculated manipulation. Dr. Torres had actually thanked me during the charity gala aftermath. "Your exposure of Hayes probably saved Lisa from years of emotional abuse," he'd said. "Men like that don't suddenly become decent husbands." The manipulation would have continued and escalated. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself in conversation with various family members about the broader lessons of the past year. Uncle Frank, a retired police officer, was particularly interested in how corruption investigations work. "The thing people don't realize," I explained, "is how much patience it requires. Building a case against powerful criminals takes years of careful documentation. You have to prove not just that money changed hands, but that everyone involved knew it was wrong." Cousin Jennifer, who worked in local government, nodded thoughtfully. "It makes me want to be extra careful about conflicts of interest in my own job. Even the appearance of impropriety can damage public trust." Those conversations reminded me why investigative journalism mattered. Beyond exposing specific crimes, good reporting helped citizens understand how their institutions worked and how to protect them from corruption. Grandma Rose called everyone together as the sun began to set, gathering us around her chair for the traditional birthday wisdom she shared each year. At 86, she'd lived through Depression, war, social upheaval, and technological revolution. Her perspective was invaluable. "I've been thinking about what happened with that senator." She began, her voice still strong despite her age. "It reminded me of something my father used to say: character is what you are when no one is watching, and reputation is what people think you are when everyone is." She looked directly at me. "Blaine, you chose character over comfort. You could have stayed quiet to keep peace in the family, but you chose to do what was right, even when it cost you personally." The recognition from someone I'd respected my entire life meant more than any professional award. "But I also want to say something to the rest of you." Grandma continued, her gaze moving around the circle of family faces. "We all make mistakes when we let appearances matter more than truth. The important thing is learning from those mistakes and doing better next time." Dad wiped his eyes as she spoke. He'd struggled more than anyone with guilt about the exclusion from last year's reunion. "I let pride cloud my judgment," he'd told me privately. "I was so impressed by the idea of having a senator in the family that I forgot to ask whether he was the kind of man who deserved to be there." As the celebration wound down, I helped clean up while reflecting on how dramatically our family had changed. The crisis with Hayes had forced us to examine our values and priorities in ways that ultimately made us stronger. Lisa approached as I carried dishes to the kitchen. "I have something I want to give you," she said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple picture frame containing a photo from that night at the charity gala. Someone had captured the moment when Hayes was being led away in handcuffs, while our family stood together watching. The image was both sobering and symbolic. "I had it printed from a news photo," Lisa explained. "I want you to have it as a reminder that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." On the back of the frame, she'd written, "To my brother, who chose truth over comfort and justice over convenience. Thank you for protecting me, even when I didn't want to be protected." As everyone prepared to leave, I found myself thinking about the letter I'd received from engineer Thomas Richardson the week before. He was the state employee who'd provided the recordings that sealed Hayes's fate. "Your investigation gave me the courage to come forward," he'd written. "I'd been documenting the safety violations for months, but was afraid of retaliation. Seeing someone willing to sacrifice personally for the truth inspired me to do the same." That letter represented something larger than individual courage. It was about creating a culture where truth-telling was valued and protected, where ordinary people felt safe reporting wrongdoing, where justice was possible, even against powerful criminals. Standing in my parents' driveway as cars pulled away, I thought about the question I wanted to pose to viewers who would hear this story. It was the same question I'd been wrestling with throughout this entire experience. When you're faced with a choice between personal comfort and moral courage, what do you choose? When doing the right thing requires sacrifice, disappointment, even rejection from people you love, do you still choose truth over convenience? I'd learned that character isn't tested when choices are easy. It's tested when doing right costs you something valuable. When standing up for your principles means standing alone. When choosing integrity means accepting consequences you don't want to face. My family had learned those lessons too. They'd discovered that impressive titles and political connections meant nothing without underlying character. That social status was worthless if it was built on lies and criminal behavior. That family loyalty should be based on love and respect, rather than fear and manipulation. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between doing what was popular and doing what was right? How did you handle it? What did you learn about yourself in the process? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and sharing it with others who might benefit from hearing about the power of choosing truth over comfort. And if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moral challenges, please subscribe to stay connected. Thank you for taking this journey with me. I hope it reminded you that integrity isn't just about grand gestures and heroic moments. It's about daily choices to value truth over lies, character over appearances, and courage over convenience. In a world that often rewards deception and manipulation, choosing honesty and integrity isn't always easy, but it's always right. And in the end, that's what matters most. May you always have the strength to choose character over comfort, and may you find family and friends who love you for who you truly are, rather than what you can do for them. Until next time, keep fighting for truth and justice, one choice at a time.